Hi, my name is Dr. Asia Eaton. I'm a psychological scientist and public psychologist, and this is Mindbridge, where science meets human rights. In this podcast, we invite human rights defenders to teach and learn from brain and behavioral scientists about how we can all use science to do human rights work that is more efficient and impactful.
Welcome. Today is Monday, March 16th, 2026. My name is Asia, and it is my great pleasure to say that we are talking today with Dr. Taj Mahon-Haft and Professor Lasana Harris about humanization and dehumanization. Dr. Taj Mahon-Haft is the director and co-founder of the Dehumanization Project. Taj is, above all, a drop-everything father, son, partner, eldest brother, and friend, as well as an avid hiker. Serving also as the director of the Dehumanization Project is tailored for Taj's training, experience, and passion. Applying his sociology doctorate from Washington State University and personal understanding, he's devoted to elevating justice-impacted voices to guide systemic change at the intersection of evidence-based policy and lived experience. He's brought humanizing perspectives about justice across Virginia and beyond, in legislative, research, educational, and organizing capacities, always centering the lived experience of the countless wonderful people whose lives have been shaped by the weight of doing time. Beyond the Dehumanization Project, he currently serves on the Virginia Coalition Against Solitary, Expungement Council, New River Valley Reentry Council, Fines and Fees Advisory Board, and Restorative Justice Legislative Coalition. Before pursuing advocacy full-time, he was an award-winning educator, a mindset that continues to shape his work. He has also served time, a lived experience that drives and shapes his work always, for his loved ones so impacted by his carceral journey and everyone still inside or suffering that trauma. Welcome, Taj.
Thank you so much, Asia. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today.
Professor Lasana Harris, our scientist, is appointed in the Department of Experimental Psychology at University College London, UCL, where he is the Vice Dean for Global Engagement in the Faculty of Brain Sciences. He's a social neuroscientist who takes an interdisciplinary approach to understanding human behavior. His research explores the brain and physiological correlates of person perception, social learning, emotions, social inferences, stereotyping, dehumanization, and more. His research addresses questions such as, how do we see people as less than human? And non-human objects like AI, institutions, and animals as human beings? How do we modulate effective responses to people? How do we make social, legal, ethical, and economic decisions? He completed his undergraduate education at Howard University and received postgraduate training at Princeton University. He has held positions at New York University, Duke University, and Leiden University before coming to UCL. He has thus far written one textbook, Invisible Mind, Flexible Social Cognition and Dehumanization, published by MIT Press. Welcome.
Thank you, Asia. Lovely to be here.
Well, I'm going to get started, as we always do, with our human rights defender, Taj, and ask you about how you got involved in work on humanization.
Yeah, so found this work on humanization at the lowest point of my own experience in the justice system, which was unexpected and very sudden. And in the realization that all the evidence that had brought me to, at that point before that, being a criminologist myself, and had really convinced me how terrible the system was, how that wasn't working to make change. And I kind of found that actually through the solution of humanization. So I needed purpose, I needed something to move forward with, but I also realized as I was coming out of this deep depression that the sudden collapse of one's life can bring in experience in the justice system, that my family, who had heard me saying these things for at least a decade at this point, and always kind of just patted me on the head and said, yeah, that's really terrible. They're liberal people, right? But they didn't take action. And all of a sudden, they're all taking action. My sister's restaurants, they're hiring almost entirely returning citizens. My mom's getting involved in legislative efforts in New Mexico. And it wasn't just them seeing what I went through because they'd heard me talk about the system before. It was them getting to know other people in that experience and realizing that everybody is a human being, regardless of whatever their convictions were. And everybody's having this really inhumane experience, regardless of how they should have been treated. And all of a sudden, they were spurred to action. So it's like, hey, the humanization, the personal story is where the action is, where we can get past. And Lasana, I did a little bit, and I'm sure going to butcher this, but the flexible social cognition that you talked about, our community had been getting explained away by being dehumanized and then morally justified in our suffering through stereotypes and talking points and cultural artifacts of all these words. I realized that what the thing was, if you only know one thing about somebody and it's offender, inmate, convict, felon, murderer, rapist, robber, addict, even if you're a progressive person, these words have negative connotations, as they often involve harm and thus should. But if you know 7 things about somebody and you like 6 of them and you dislike one of them even strongly, that person is your friend. So that's a whole different way of engaging somebody than only knowing that term. And so we just took this thing and said, where can we humanize? And I was an educator, started with education, but then it's gotten to where in our mission is amplifying and elevating justice impacted voices to humanize the conversation and therefore get humane, compassionate policy and experiences, right? Putting this human experience at the center of this conversation, and it's any realm. And I'll talk more about that, but that's how I was kind of finding it by accident in my own dehumanized experience.
So let me ask then, how would you define humanization? It sounds like something having to do with context, something having to do with relatability. What would you say it is to humanize someone?
To make them a 3-dimensional person. It's to give them resonance and relatability to people who have shared experiences, which we all do if we get past whatever we've been reduced to.
It's beautiful. Lasana, you study humanization of non-human objects and dehumanization of people. Tell me a little bit about your work and how you define those terms.
Sure. I think Taj's definition of humanization is one of the best I've ever heard. It's really wonderful. I think the way I have thought about dehumanization is in a very straightforward manner. I think when we encounter other people, there's a host of cognitive and affective processes, which just means we think and we feel about them in particular ways. And what I try to understand is how those processes are essentially switched on and off when we encounter other people. So for me, dehumanization is simply encountering someone and failing to consider their minds, their subjective experiences, what's going on inside of their heads. And that's a very simple definition, but I think a very powerful one because it really reveals what's at the core of how we interact with other people. If we think about the way we encounter objects out in the world, you're not thinking about what does this table think of me, or is the table in a good or bad mood? That's something we tend to reserve for other people. So cases where we encounter people and we don't engage this additional thought process is how I've defined dehumanization. Now, dehumanization, with that definition, differs widely from how lots of people define dehumanization, which is influenced quite heavily by the way we've used the term to describe propaganda material during cases of human atrocities. So, a lot of people think of dehumanization as likening people to animals or objects, using negative metaphors, saying they're less evolved. I think the things I'm describing are relevant in those situations as well. But my definition allows us to consider more things as dehumanizing than we typically might. As Taj mentioned, if you've reduced someone to a stereotype or a category label, that's dehumanizing because that category label brings with it all the information you think you need about what's going on with that person, when in actuality it doesn't. It's a way of hiding or reducing their humanity as well. So I've talked about stereotypes and labels as dehumanizing as well, because I have this broader definition for what I consider to be dehumanization. Humanization, on the other hand, is quite fascinating because that's where I feel like I haven't really gotten a great definition for it. And that's why I love Taj's definition, right? This sort of three-dimensional perspective, appreciating that there's similarities and shared experiences with other people, but also appreciating that people are complex. What we're often doing when we're out in the world, walking about, interacting with people, is we're trying to simplify, which is one of the reasons processes like dehumanization have stuck around with us, right? They're ways of simplifying the things we're encountering. But fundamentally, I think human beings are very complex creatures, right? We have all of these different identities and groups we might belong to, and facets of our personality and experiences. And when you zoom out enough, ironically, you see that all of that stuff is shared with other people. That's what binds us as a species, right? That's the common humanity we're all talking about. And that's what gets lost a lot when you think about interacting with other human beings strictly by thinking of them as these category labels, which again, we think of as necessary for navigating the complexity of life. So for me, we've never really been able to define what humanity or humanization is, but I think most people know it when they feel it or they see it, just as we all know when we're being dehumanized as well. So by looking at how we humanize objects like AI or animals, it gives me some clues as to how we elevate those entities into the realm of humanity and helps me better grasp what we mean by humanizing someone, right? It's considering them as the person that they are, the full complex individual that they are.
As you're saying this, I love that we're on the same general wavelength of that. The broader kind of, it's not just about Nazis talking about Jews as rats, right? Like that's it's way more than that, way broader. It's and as you're saying this, I thought it's thinking about what it might like to be someone else, or at least considering what that would be, right? Like it's really like just being able to say, hey, that person has feelings, and I might share, like I might understand that, right? I think that's really, I really appreciate that, Lasana. Sorry, I was just loved that explanation.
No, and that's great because that's exactly what that cognitive process is, right? When we get inside somebody's heads, if we use the scientific term mentalize or engage social cognition, perspective take, it's what leads us to empathize with people, right? So it's impossible to empathize with someone without considering what it is their experience is like, right? What it is that they're going through. And we tend to value empathy as this panacea of sort for interacting with other human beings, but we don't often take the time to appreciate that in order to get there, I first have to just consider, right, what your experience is like. And it's so easy to hide people's experiences that we go about our lives just failing to consider other people. There's a really fascinating demonstration of this all the way back in the 1970s with regular human being. I love to talk about this experiment. A psychologist called Rodin basically walked people down the street and then had them sit at a park. And when they sat on this park bench, they had a bunch of strangers come up and ask them things like directions or what time it is. And then they just did a simple memory test. They said, how many of these people do you recognize? And on average, people recognize like 25% of these people who they just had a conversation with, right? It shows you how superficially we're processing people, even the ones we interact with. So if you encounter someone and the first thing you hear is a category label, there's no need to process them further, right? You've sort of tricked the brain into thinking you have enough. But what you've done is completely hidden their humanity, right? What makes them them, right? In the same way that you have features about you that make you you, and you would like people to recognize those features and embrace them.
All the best experiments are back in the 70s.
Yeah, before we had, strict human subjects protections.
All the worst ones too, which is
All
why
the
we've
worst ones
evolved.
too. No.
But the best ones also.
Yeah,
You
no.
couldn't do Milgram anymore.
We've tried, certainly not.
Let me ask, I'm thinking about what you said, Lasana, about how the way we humanize non-human animals and objects sheds light on what it takes to humanize and what it means to dehumanize. I'm thinking about how easy it is for people to humanize their pets. They give them thought processes, intentions, emotions, desires, all these complex mental states we attribute to our animals. Why is it easy to do that for your pet and hard to do that for another human being?
That's the paradox, isn't it? And it's something that has baffled me. I remember watching people when I lived in New York, when I was at NYU, I had an apartment on the second floor, so I could see the street below me. And I'd see people walking their well-manicured pets off to doggy daycare in coats while the homeless guy sat on the corner, and they would just fly by the homeless guy and they'd be fussing behind the pet. And it just seems so remarkable to me. Like, take an evolutionary perspective. The homeless guy is your species, right? Like, if it's all about propagating our genes into the future, you should care about that guy, not the pet. I think it's easy for the pets because the interaction with the pets are less complex than it is with other human beings. So I really think it's about the complexity. So take dogs in particular, for instance, right? They're often described as unconditional lovers, right? They love you regardless, right? They're not going to judge you because they're having a bad day and they take it out on you. And so, because I think those interactions are less complex, it's somehow easier to get these mechanisms going because that's who we are as human beings, right? We're built to interact with other human beings, right? And so, if interacting with regular people is too complicated, right, we sort of make them where they're not, right? So, pets become those people that we interact with, or whatever it may be, right? For a new generation, it's going to be AI, for instance. And so we have these needs, these desires, these motives to interact with others, to engage in these thought processes, to figure out what they're thinking, to know that there's people that care about us out there, that love us. And it's hard to do that with humans in the way societies are currently constructed. And so we use these shortcuts because it makes sense, and we end up robbing some people of their humanity, and we fill in those blanks in other places. But that's really one of the paradoxes that motivates a lot of the work we're doing in my lab.
Taj, the Humanization Project is all about doing this work of making people three-dimensional. This work that sometimes requires extra effort and requires openness to the complexities of individuals' experiences. How does the Humanization Project do this? What's its approach?
By presenting not just one voice, but this broad swath of justice impacted voices in every possible situation where we can humanize, right? It's not about a particular issue that we're trying to fix or a particular way of doing things. It is humanization is the mission. So wherever we, and that includes not just people that are currently behind bars, but it includes our loved ones who are also impacted by the justice system and returning citizens and even survivors, because most of the people who have survived harm are people who are in the same communities that are over policed and over incarcerated, right? Those things tend to they tend to coincide, right? And so wherever we can bring this, and so that includes things, there's educational work. We have this Humanizing the Classroom program where we actually have teachers behind bars educating today's college students who will be tomorrow's justice professionals about the system from the perspective of those who are impacted right now. We do legislative advocacy where we bring, everybody from our community, loved ones, returning citizens, and even the voices of people inside to the legislative advocacy space to put a human tone on what these bills do or do not do, so that way they can be considered instead of those talking points on human terms. We do it through qualitative research, certainly. I actually did some ethnographic publications that were not IRB approved while I was inside. I got informed consent, but I couldn't get IRB approval because of my status, and I still got to publish, so it's okay sometimes. They were very humanizing and positive, but so we do that, and then organize our own community, like people who are justice impacted, right? That means we need to understand how this whole system works. Systems are created through laws, right? Our social structure. And if they're going to impact our lives, we need to know what's going on and how to engage that. And most of the time, our community of people who've been left out and trampled upon by the system. forever and ever and feel very intimidated by it. So being a bit of a bridge, because I have that subject matter expertise officially, but also the lived experience, and I can kind of speak both of those languages. It allows me to kind of put my foot in the door, so to speak, and because people in the legislature or in college campuses or wherever I sound and look and have the same experiences and background, but then I push the door open and say, here, all my friends too. And now we're all here. And it's very hard to just say, oh, well, that's only one person to like exceptionalize the one outlier case, because it's people from all different backgrounds demographically, but also from all different experiences of how they ended up justice impacted. And as a result, you get this kind of broad swath of like, huh, something in there. And so that's the who and the how, but then it's also the what do we talk about? We always try to bring things back to this very like, maybe we'll reference a bill or a project or something, but it's like, how do we bring this back to what this is actually like to experience? And so it's like, this is how it felt for me. This is how my son was impacted by this. This is how my mom experienced that visit after she was mistreated that way. This is what it's like when it's so frustrating and you're inside and you're trying to get something done and nobody will listen. Like just really making it something relatable and resonant to something that other people go through in their own frustrations, even if it's not the justice.
And I really like that approach because I think ultimately what you're doing is giving people stories, right? Narratives. And that's what we can relate to as human beings, right? Like if you can tell a good story about somebody's experience, you've communicated information to allow me to imagine what it must be like to be that person. And that's really at the core of what makes us human beings as well, right? The fact that we exchange these stories. When you think about the labels like incarcerated, there's stories about those too, right? But those stories are tied to the labels. They're not actual stories about real people's experiences. They're these aggregated things that best represent the label. They're not what's happening underground for a lot of people. So I think it's really important to have those narratives and those stories. And like you said, multiple stories, right? So that it's not just the one, right? You're not able to write that off as some strange exemplar, right? You're getting lots of different stories that are all triangulating on the same point. I think that's a really, really useful approach.
Yeah, and I'm going to add one thought here, and this is because this is a thing that I often bring to a room of people that have not ever been or been around people who are justice impacted. And I say, in a lifetime of classrooms and boardrooms and hallowed halls, most of the most intelligent, driven, motivated, moral, and ethical people I met in person. And then it's like, what? And let me introduce you to some of them. And then see all the things that are so impressive that they do besides whatever did or did not happen that led to their incarceration.
Lasana, you're a social neuroscientist. We have a lot of psychological scientists on this podcast. We haven't had as many neuroscientists. So I want to make sure that I tap your expertise and ask you, can you train the brain to do more humanization? And what would that look like and how would it work?
What's really interesting when you consider the brain is that by default, we tend to get inside of other people's heads. So if I were to take you and put you in an MRI machine and not give you any instructions, you would start thinking about other people. Once we mind wander or mind start drifting, 90 to 95% of what we think about are other people. So by default, we tend to think about other people. In fact, we call this the brain network that allows us to get inside other people's heads, the default mode network, right? It's always on, it's always engaged by default. It's also really interesting when you think about the anthropomorphism. That's where we attribute minds to things that don't have them, because we also do that by default spontaneously. It doesn't take any effort to get you to start loving your pet. So we're actually at a huge advantage in that sense, right? Because this is what the brain wants to do. The issue is that we have so many, I would say, structural barriers that get in the way of preventing that behavior from naturally occurring. So the minute you've slapped a label on somebody, you've changed the way they've been processed. So it's as if you've hidden their humanity from the brain and you've short-circuited the processes that want to get going by default. So I actually think it's a lot easier than a lot of people give it credit for. The problems are that we live in societies that have these structures built up that prevent us from doing it. So even if I may sit with someone and have a nice conversation while we're in this particular room about their experiences and it begins to change how I think about such people, I then leave that room and I spend the rest of my life in a society where these structures are preventing me from engaging in this kind of natural processing. So I always pass the buck or turn the blame to structural variables, right? I always say, well, based on what we understand about the brain, this isn't hard to do, right? There has to be something out in the world that prevents us from doing it. And now we've gone beyond my expertise, so I'm off the hook, right? So I turn to the sociologists and the political scientists and I say, how could we then better engineer a society that removes some of these barriers from us? Because again, it's what we're built to do. That's who we are as a species. We love to think about other people. It's the reason social media is so widely popular. Just look at people walking down the street, right? They're consuming information about other people. They can't get enough of it. That's who we are, right? But we don't do it for everyone. And that's where the problems start.
I can't tell you how much I appreciate that response, that we are by default ultra social creatures. When our brains are resting, they're really thinking about people all the time. This is our evolved inclination, and it's structures like the carceral system, the justice system, that prevent us from our natural instinct of thinking about what people are thinking about and humanizing them. Taj, tell us a little bit about the work you've done to address these structures.
So it's interesting because we kind of approach it, like I said, wherever we can find a foothold. And I feel like we've done legislative work to directly affect the structure. It's not about the perception side of it. And in that side, it's what is the actual structure of the justice system. This is a we're not supposed to say admit all that much necessarily, but while I was incarcerated, the founding of the organization, our first foray into the legislative space, which was mostly going to be education and research, the idea of humanization fit there, and that was my background really. But then some other people inside and I saw an opportunity when there was a particular change in the political climate in Virginia, and one of the people that was elected had previously been incarcerated. We took a bill to them, my now wife, then partner, and I, co-founder, that we had actually drafted from inside that said, hey, we're going to retroactively change the amount of good time that people can earn, because Virginia had a system that was exactly what you would expect from the former capital of the Confederacy, in the first place that blackness and whiteness were legally enshrined, right? That is what you get. And so that actually passed thanks to a confluence of many factors that were unfortunate, but also made for good headwind or tailwinds. And through our leadership in this humanizing approach. And so that one bill has reduced Virginia's prison population 17% permanently. So we've tackled the structure piece like that. That's like, as a sociologist, I'm like, hey, that's systemic change when you're talking about that kind of numbers. And it's not done, it's not quite abolitionism, but that feels good. But that's also not really tackling the perception like it was tackling perception to get the law changed. It has this kind of immediate structural effect. But what I think I'm more excited about is really tackling the broader perceptions. And that's where this intersection of with tomorrow's policymakers and policy actors, justice system actors, connecting with them on college campuses before they get into their career and get into cultures that encourage dehumanization of the other, who is your inherent adversary in the American legal system, right? Like, let's get to where people are experiencing human beings, that they have this humanization already ingrained in their understanding as they reach their professional opportunities. And then we all know still how to ride a bike, right? It's literally something we all reference. It's something we learned when we were young, right? That's the whole point. Ingrain the foundational understanding of humanization. And so, like I said, we do that with this humanizing the classroom thing that I just cannot speak to the power of, not just for the students, but also for the guys inside who are being ontologically, pedagogically recognized as sources of knowledge and wisdom, even as they're still inside. And that's really reshapes their identity and their sense of opportunity and engagement with education. And for teachers, obviously, it's a great thing. So like with that, but even as we have events around the state and wherever, or through social media, like wherever we can, we really lean into this, like let's just put this three-dimensional view of whatever this is on display wherever somebody will listen, especially, and there's not enough, we don't have enough money to, or cloud to get anybody on a high social media scale to pay attention really. So we have to do this in targeted ways through audiences that we're like, hey, this is people that can really take this understanding and do something with it until we can get to a place where, Donald Trump is not president, dehumanization is not the order of the day, right? Like there's still some uphill structurally in the culture, which is kind of a juxtaposition concepts, but like how we reach culture on a broad scale is not quite accessible yet, but we are trying to do it where we can. And that was a really long answer. I apologize.
I appreciate that because I think when I think about structures, yes, I'm talking about things like the justice system as well, but I also mean other kinds of structures. And I'll try to bring this to life. And I'm glad you mentioned culture because that's part of what the issue is as well. So if you think about the human brains, we're hypersocial, we're built to interact with other people, but that was when we knew 150 people or so, right? If you think about our evolutionary history, we lived in these tiny little groups and we've had massive population explosion since then. And so we rely on shortcuts like labels because they help us deal with the complexity. So part of the structural problem is the massive complexity of life, the way that we currently live it in the 21st century. But we also have tools that we're building, like social media, which gives us advantages that we didn't have previously, right? So now I can find out about somebody's experience on the other side of the world who I know nothing about, who I've never met personally, because those stories and narratives can be transmitted because of the technology. So I think when we think structures, yes, it's really important to focus on political and legal structures, cultural structures as well, but also think about how the structures that just result from the way society is currently constructed can be overcome. And I think we have the tools, the technology to be able to start overcoming some of those structures. It was really interesting to me, Taj, when you said we don't have the money for social media influencers because already you're thinking about using those tools as a way to get this humanizing narrative across to people, right? So intuitively, a lot of us are aware of the things that we can do to change some of these narratives. So then the question becomes, well, what's the problem? Why aren't we doing it? And then we have the cultural issues, right? Then we have those kinds of structural problems as well, because those are also structures that govern how we live. So I think it's really important to think of structure very broadly. Yes, with the sort of legal political systems, but also the cultural systems that prevent us from convincing a social media influencer to coming on board unless you're coming with a bag of money, right? That's a structural, that's a structural concern as well. And so it's such a layered set of systems that are creating these barriers to our natural inclinations. It's very fascinating.
You've given me so much to think about. I'm thinking about capitalism as a system, mass media as a system, and culture as a system. I kind of want to dig into this media issue because I'm a feminist psychologist. I've done a lot of research on the harms of mass media as regards self-objectification, particularly for young women, and how that relates to problems with body image and disordered eating. But it sounds like you might characterize these systems as um, mass media, for example, as being able to be used for human rights or for human rights abuses. Can you tell me a little bit more about what it would look like to use these systems to support social justice and human rights?
Absolutely. I think we already have some positive examples. And so, after the genocide in Rwanda, for instance, social psychologists went in there and they used the radio, which was a popular form of media back then, to demonstrate how you can have these positive changes. So, they essentially created a soap opera on the media, which was a popular format that people in Rwanda listened to. And they had people in one part of the country listen to this soap opera where, again, the stories that were being told were about inter-ethnic marriages and the difficulties associated with that, and all of the kinds of humanizing stuff that Taj is doing a great job of. And when you compared the attitudes, the ideas, the way that people who had been exposed to this form of media were towards their outgroups, right? The people that had suffered the genocide and even the perpetrators, their own groups as well, compared to people that hadn't heard that kind of media, there were massive differences in the direction that you would expect. So for me, things like media and even capitalism, right? These are tools that we can use for good or bad, right? They're not inherently good or bad per se. There's no reason, for instance, capitalism should operate the way that it currently does, where we reward people that are good at making large sums of money, right? We should reward people that do other kinds of things, people that keep the economy going, like, or key workers, as we call them, right? During COVID, we all discovered how important the delivery driver was for making everything work. And suddenly we've seemed to have forgotten that the minute the virus has gone away. So these are tools that we have at our disposal. The problem is we don't use those tools in the best possible way. So I'm a big fan of media regulation, which gets a lot of blowback because people think, oh, freedom of speech. But we regulate the media already, right? We control content when it comes to sexually explicit information and particular types of language. Why can't we control that content for stereotypic images, for instance, or things that perpetuate ideas and biases about groups of people? So I think these tools are quite powerful for driving change, right? We just don't use them in that way. Currently, we've sort of left it up to other people to decide how to use those tools, and they're being used in the ways they currently are. So I don't think we need to tear everything down necessarily. I just think we need some tweaks, right? A little bit of well-placed legislation, like Taj mentioned, that can propel us to engage in the kinds of behaviors with these tools that would lead to the positive change we'd like to see.
I want to add on to that because, Lasana, that was just absolutely brilliant. And I think we coming from, so as a Marxist back in the day, I'm a materialist, right? These are the systems in which we exist. So we have to use these systems, right? They're not inherently bad or good. It's what are we doing with them? And therefore, regulation is important because everything you just said. But I want to just contextualize where I think in my lifetime, I'm 47 now, there's been two things where culturally we have come a long way in humanization in the United States. And those two realms are with the LGBTQ community and with marijuana, right? Those are two things that have completely shifted politically, culturally, in all possible ways in a very short period of time relative to social change, right? And in both of those cases, I really think it was through this humanization. First, I mean, we papers have been written about Ellen's value in that whole movement for same-sex opportunities and equality and just real consideration, human consideration, right? It's because she was in people's living rooms, right? And then look at heated rivalry right now. Who thought that hockey would ever be humanized? But I'm being silly, but like we really have. And then with cannabis, it was like everybody knew somebody who smoked it and was like, no, that everything with this reefer madness stuff is nonsense because I know that's wrong because I can relate. It resonates, right? And so where we've embraced that in our cultural forms, especially in mass media, it tends to trickle down. There's the one thing that does trickle down. Trickle economics do not. But the culture really does when we humanize, when we normalize things in those mainstream things. So like, yeah, we have to use these tools. If they're going to be there anyway, let's make sure they're not being used to dehumanize. Let's try to find ways to really lean into that.
Absolutely. And you saw the shift in the other direction for cigarettes and tobacco, right? Like in my lifetime, that went the other way. It went from being cool to being like, are you serious? You can't possibly be ingesting that substance. And so if you take that media point seriously and you say, well, why is America so polarized? It's not surprising, right? People are getting two very different sets of narratives across these different platforms. There's nothing that's allowing people to get exposure to the other side and the other sets of information. And a lot of people now, I think, who are actively trying to work on polarization are taking that head on, right? They're saying you can't just look at Fox News, you can't just look at MSNBC, right? You're always going to get one particular point of view. Because again, that's who we are as a species, right? We're learning all the time, constantly learning from the people around us and the stuff that we're seeing. So if we're only getting one kind of stuff, well, of course we're going to behave in a manner consistent with that. It's not surprising at all. We can do something about that, right? There's nothing to prevent us. That doesn't require us building a new kind of human being, right? That requires some small tweaks. And I think that's where the potential is.
So As I'm listening to you two talk about, how same-sex marriage has been legalized in the US potentially as a result of humanizing queer people, and how marijuana has been legalized in many places in the US as a result of humanizing users. I'm thinking about how those are relatively common phenomenon in our landscapes, running into members of the LGBTQ community, people who smoke marijuana. What about for individuals who belong to groups or live in spaces that are segregated or are less common? In the field of psychology, we have this hypothesis called contact hypothesis that says, one of the best ways to sort of reduce intergroup prejudice is to have positive social contact, but you can't have personal contact with all types of people necessarily, right? So how do we get around that? Is it parasocial contact? How can we help to humanize the folks that we don't see every day necessarily?
I think it is parasocial contact in part, right? I think it is the narratives, the stories you get through media. I think that's a big part of it. I mean, before LGBTQ was as normalized as it was, you weren't as around as many people, not because they didn't have those um, ways of living their lives and those preferences for same-sex people, but because they hid it, right? So you couldn't say that it's because I was exposed to a bunch of people, right? The exposure first came through the media, and then people felt more comfortable revealing who they are. And I think that's true of political opinions as well, right? So at the moment, if you belong to a particular political group, you don't agree with everything that group agrees with, right? You have certain things you agree with and other things you perhaps don't agree, but you're not allowed to say you disagree, right? So you'll never get to hear those alternate opinions. And they remain hidden, much like people's sexual status were in the 70s and 80s. So I think the media exposure, the parasocial relationships, through that normalizes these things where people are now more willing to come out and say, well, I actually disagree with this particular point of view. I have a difference on this issue. And then they begin to see that other people are also sort of holding those opinions as well, and the perceived norm of the situation changes. And that's where the real power is. I mean, the contact hypothesis is still the best way to alleviate prejudice, right? It's just that we don't live in societies that facilitate that. Now, again, part of that has to do with housing regulation and zoning and financial systems. And there are lots of people doing really good work in those areas, trying to break down those physical barriers to interacting with lots of types of people. But we do live in the age of the internet where narratives and stories are readily available in everybody's pockets, right? And they're out there, and there are no censors stopping you finding those contents. The algorithms are stopping you, right? Because they're feeding you more of the same types of stuff. So you're not getting exposure to the different kinds of stuff, but it's still out there. It's available to you. People aren't aware that it even exists in a lot of cases, just like they weren't aware of the sexual preferences of their neighbors 40 years ago. But that doesn't mean it's not there. So even though there is still the physical segregation, and we do need to break that down, there are other ways to get around that that I think can be very useful as well.
Yeah, I want to, Lasana, we got to talk more. I love everything you're saying. I'm going to add on two pieces with that. So first of all, I am confident that justice impacted is a more common category than gay hockey players, right? People are much more likely to know the former than the latter. Yet we've managed to humanize through people. I'm picking on that, but it's a really good example going on right now of something that is vanishingly small in terms of the likelihood that somebody would actually encounter this human experience on a close level, but has changed so many people's by the millions perceptions, right? And so there's this profit element that's always built into that, right? But I think this other piece of this is so part of it is just getting, as you're saying, getting the stories to be the ones that are told in these mass settings. But I think the other piece of that is getting people to think beyond the categories they put people in, even when they know that it's not that simple. And I think for instance, like for my family, like even as I was starting my journey through the justice system, they kind of had this idea that mine was a uniquely different humanity than other people in there. And I don't know that they would tell you that this is what they thought, but looking back, I think this is what they had kind of internalized, right? And there's a recent study, 47% of Americans will have an immediate family member incarcerated at some point in their life. at this point. And that could be for a day or two for drunk driving, right? Whatever. Like that's a very broad definition of that. But that means everybody or half of everybody is experiencing this, but yet most people aren't going to actually think of it on human terms because they think, oh, well, that was just my cousin and he just got that drunk that one time and then, or he just got caught shoplifting, or they got him and his wife in that argument and they both got arrested. It kind of got out of hand. But like you kind of exceptionalize naturally because you've been fed this strong cultural narrative so much and aren't getting anything with more nuance up to this point, right? We need these nuanced stories to be out there so people can realize that the exception that they have seen or have encountered is actually the norm, and it is not the assumption and the reduction that is where they should stick. Because, like you said, Lasana, going through our lives, we categorize things in order to get by with so much input, right? So let's get people out of those simple categorizations.
I have so much regret that I have to wrap this podcast up. I wish we could keep going, but out of respect for your time and the length of the medium, I have to ask you each for a final word or a final thought.
I could go. First of all, this really was inspiring. It's always wonderful to talk to people who share this point of view because this is not the prevailing view in psychology and the general public. So it's always inspiring when people get it. I think a final thought for me is hopeful. I'm always very hopeful because I feel like the issues we're dealing with are issues that aren't insurmountable, right? I feel like we're built to defeat the kinds of things that we're dealing with. My worry comes from the pace of change, the fact that as soon as we seem to get to grips on one issue, another one pops up and it makes it feel overwhelming. But I'm always entirely hopeful because the brain is entirely plastic. It's always learning and adapting and adjusting. And we're built to be social creatures, right? Like that's who we are at our core. It just matters who we consider as social or not. But those things aren't fixed. They're also flexible. And the ways we view different categories of people and types of people are constantly changing. So I'm always inherently hopeful. And a lot of the reason why I do this research is to understand these basic mechanisms, which gives me hope as well, right? It sort of keeps me going in light of all of the stuff that is currently happening all around us. So thanks again for the chat. It was wonderful.
It's an absolute pleasure. Whenever you encounter somebody, actually, this is to anybody listening, would you want to be considered forever according to the worst thing, be it 5 years ago or 30 years ago, that anybody ever accused you of doing or that you ever did and didn't get caught for? I think for everybody in the world, the answer is no, because none of us are that simple. And I think my final thought is that whether it's justice impacted or any other category in which we reduce people to dehumanize them through perfectly normal processes in this complex social world, that we always ask ourselves, how would it feel if that was me? Right? That's the key to humanization, is like whatever, before you make a judgment, how might that feel if that was me? Is it that simple? Because I don't think it ever is. But I'm also heartened by the fact that I think most people, to your point, Lasana, most people really are good to each other, and we're getting kinder and more empathetic over time. Like if without social media telling us every tragic thing that's happening all around the world all the time, this is the most peaceful time in human history, right? By far, we're better to each other. We have denormalized interpersonal violence in our average. Guys used to just beat each other up all the time, and it wasn't even considered criminal. But that is no longer acceptable, right? We are advancing and we are being decent to each other to the point of being decent to our pets, which, while we started with that example, is also kind of how kind and empathetic we have become when given the chance to feel that way and not reduce people. So there is a hopefulness to it. And conversations like this and people like us, and I'm honored to be included in this. That's where the change is made. Is well, they need to fund everything we're all doing, is what I'm saying.
Yes. Yes. Fund Professor Harris's lab, fund the Humanization Project, fund Mindbridge, and we can continue to do this good work. All right. Thank you so much. And I will stop recording.
Thank you for listening. That was Mindbridge, where science meets human rights. To learn more about how we use brain and behavioral science to empower human rights defenders, find us at mindbridgecenter.org and follow us on social media.